There is a kind of silence that only exists in courtrooms. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of comfort. It is the silence of people holding their breath, waiting for something to break, waiting for the weight of everything that has been said and done and hidden to finally land on someone who deserves it. And on a Tuesday morning in a family court in the American Midwest, that silence arrived. It arrived in the form of a woman sitting alone at a wooden table, no attorney beside her, no legal team behind her, no polished briefcase full of color-coded strategy. Just a woman. A folder. And 3 years of something that no amount of money could buy, leverage, or destroy. Her name was Rossy Caldwell. And if you had walked into that courtroom on the morning this story reaches its peak and looked at the 2 tables facing the judge's bench, you would have assumed, without hesitation, that you already knew how this was going to end. Because across the aisle from Rossy sat her husband, Richard Caldwell. Corporate attorney. Country club member. A man who had spent the better part of 3 years methodically dismantling every pillar of stability his wife had ever stood on. Beside Richard sat Gregory Harlow, senior partner at Harlow & Associates, one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the state, a man whose hourly rate landed at $850, a man who had never once walked out of a courtroom without exactly what his client wanted. Richard had a legal team. Richard had a strategy. Richard had accounts his wife didn't know existed, assets tucked behind layers of paperwork designed to be invisible, and an absolute, unshakable certainty that he had already won this before it began. And Rossy had a folder. A plain manila folder. And whatever was inside it was about to do something that Richard Caldwell, with all his legal expertise, all his hidden money, and all his carefully constructed arrogance, never saw coming. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story, from the very first moment to the very last word the judge spoke, is one of the most remarkable things I have ever come across. And you are going to want to hear every single second of it. To understand what happened in that courtroom, you have to go back. You have to go back past the divorce filings, past the frozen accounts, past the locked doors and the legal notices and the years of silence. You have to go back to where Richard and Rossy Caldwell began, because the beginning of this story is not a courtroom. It is a law school library in the fall of 1998, somewhere in the American Midwest, where a young woman named Rossy Harmon was sitting at a study table surrounded by case briefs and highlighters and the particular kind of exhaustion that only first-generation college students know, the exhaustion of knowing that everything you are doing here costs more than you can afford to fail at. Rossy Harmon grew up in Columbus, Ohio. Her father was a postal worker. Her mother managed the cafeteria at a public elementary school. They were good people, hard-working people, the kind of people who showed up every single day and did what needed to be done without asking for applause or recognition or anything other than the quiet dignity of a life lived honestly. And they raised a daughter who carried all of that with her, every step, every year, every decision. Rossy was the first person in her family to attend a 4-year university. She was the first to apply to law school. She got in on academic scholarships and a personal statement that, by accounts of the admissions committee member who later spoke about it, was one of the most compelling things they had read in a decade. It was not about ambition in the conventional sense. It was not about climbing or winning or accumulating. It was about justice. About what it meant to live in a country with laws, and what happened to the people who couldn't afford to understand those laws, and why that gap existed, and what one person, if they were determined enough, could do to close it even slightly. She arrived at law school with that purpose burning inside her. She was sharp. She was focused. And she was, by the accounts of nearly everyone who sat near her in those first-year classes, someone you did not want to argue against in a moot court exercise, because she had a way of finding the weakness in an argument and pressing on it, quietly and precisely, until the whole thing gave way. It was in that environment that she met Richard Caldwell. Richard was the son of a Cincinnati businessman, raised in a household where success was not an aspiration but an expectation. He was polished, confident, and genuinely intelligent, a combination that made him magnetic in the way that certain men are magnetic when they are still young enough for their confidence to read as potential rather than arrogance. He and Rossy found each other over late-night study sessions and terrible vending machine coffee, and the particular kind of bond that forms between two people who are both grinding toward the same impossible goal at the same impossible hour. By their second year, they were inseparable. By their third year, they were in love. And by the time graduation arrived, they had made plans. Real plans. The kind of plans that feel, when you are 26 years old and in love and holding a law degree, like they were always going to work out exactly as you imagined. The plan was simple. Richard had already been recruited by a mid-sized firm in Chicago, a real opportunity, the kind that didn't come twice. Rossy had 1 semester left before she could sit for the bar. She would finish. They would both practice. They would build something together. That was the plan. But plans have a way of bending under the weight of real life, and the first bend came quickly. Richard's firm wanted him to start immediately. The salary was generous. The opportunity was real. And Rossy, who was 3 months pregnant with their first child, Harmony, made a decision that she would spend the next 14 years revisiting. She deferred her bar preparation. Just temporarily, she told herself. Just until Richard was settled, until Harmony arrived, until the dust of this enormous transition cleared enough for her to find her footing again. Temporarily. That word has a way of stretching in a marriage, particularly when one person's career is accelerating and the other person's is standing still. Richard made partner faster than anyone at his firm expected. His name began appearing in business publications. His client list grew. His reputation hardened into something formidable. And Rossy, who had once argued circles around her first-year classmates and written a personal statement that moved an admissions committee to action, was managing a household, raising their children, and telling herself that her turn was coming. Their son, Marcus, arrived 2 years after Harmony. And by the time Marcus was in preschool, the conversation that Rossy had been waiting to have, the one about her career, about her bar exam, about the plans they had made standing in a law school library at 26 years old, that conversation had become something Richard redirected with practiced ease every time she raised it. He was not cruel about it. That is important to understand, because cruelty would have been easier to name. He was reasonable. He was logical. He pointed out, correctly, that his career was at a critical stage. He pointed out that they had built a lifestyle that required his income to maintain. He pointed out that the children were young, that stability mattered, that there would be time, there would always be time, and that the most important thing right now was not to disrupt what was working. And Rossy, who loved him, who trusted him, who had poured 14 years of her life into the foundation of a family she believed in, said yes. Again and again, she said yes. She managed their home with the same precision and intelligence she had once brought to legal arguments. She supported every late night, every work trip, every client dinner, every moment that Richard needed the infrastructure of a stable home so that his career could function at the level it had reached. She was present for every school play, every parent-teacher conference, every childhood illness and birthday and ordinary Tuesday evening that built, brick by brick, into a life. She did all of this without complaint, without bitterness, without the kind of visible resentment that might have given Richard something to point to later. She did it because she believed, genuinely and completely, that they were building something together. That belief was one of the most expensive mistakes she ever made. The moment everything changed arrived on a Thursday afternoon in October. Rossy had been in Columbus visiting her mother for 4 days, something she did every few months, a ritual that kept her connected to the woman who had raised her and to the version of herself that existed before she became Richard Caldwell's wife. She drove back to Chicago in the early afternoon, pulling into the driveway of the home she had lived in for 11 years, the home she had decorated and maintained and filled with the particular warmth that certain houses carry when someone has loved them carefully. She got out of the car. She walked to the front door. She put her key in the lock. And the key did not turn. She tried again. And again. She stepped back and looked at the door, at the lock, at the house, trying to make sense of what she was experiencing. There was a business card taped to the doorframe. A locksmith's business card. And on her phone, which she pulled from her pocket with hands that had not yet started shaking, was a text message from Richard. 7 words. 7 words that she would read and reread for years afterward, turning them over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it. I've spoken to my attorney. Don't make this harder. She called his number. He did not answer. She called again. Voicemail. She stood on the porch of the home she had made, her suitcase at her feet, 200 miles from her mother, and understood in that moment, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that this had not been a spontaneous decision. The locks had been changed. The attorney had already been retained. A plan had already been executed. This was not a fight that had escalated. This was a removal. Surgical, strategic, and carried out by a man who understood, better than most people alive, exactly how these situations work legally and practically and in every other dimension that mattered. Within 48 hours, Rossy discovered that every joint bank account she and Richard shared had been frozen. Every credit card connected to their household came back declined. And her children, Harmony and Marcus, had been told by their father that their mother had decided to leave the family. She had decided nothing. She had been locked out of her own home, stripped of access to shared finances, and recast in the narrative Richard was already constructing as a woman who had chosen to abandon the people who needed her. Rossy spent 6 weeks on her best friend's couch. She ate whatever her friend offered. She borrowed clothes for job interviews. She made calls and sent emails and tried to hold herself together with the particular determination of a woman who has been told, through action rather than words, that she is nothing, and who is spending every waking hour trying to decide whether to believe it. She did not believe it. That matters. That is the thread that runs through everything that comes after. In those 6 weeks on that couch, in the worst stretch of her adult life, Rossy Caldwell did not collapse. She got very, very quiet. And when a person like Rossy gets that quiet, it is not emptiness. It is the sound of something being decided. The legal filings arrived shortly after. Richard's attorney, Gregory Harlow, had constructed a case with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. The filings claimed that Rossy had abandoned the marital home voluntarily. They claimed she was emotionally unstable and financially dependent. They described her as having no marketable skills, no professional history of substance, and no realistic ability to provide for their children going forward. Richard was seeking full custody of Harmony and Marcus. He was seeking the family home. He was seeking spousal support, not from himself to Rossy, but from Rossy to him. From the woman whose accounts he had frozen. From the woman sleeping on a borrowed couch. He wanted her to pay him. The audacity of that ask would have been almost impressive if it had not been so deliberately designed to crush whatever remained of her sense of her own standing. Gregory Harlow filed those motions with the smooth confidence of a man who had seen this particular playbook work before, and he had every reason to believe it would work again. Richard had the resources. Richard had the home. Richard had the narrative. And Rossy, by every visible measure, had nothing. Except that she did not have nothing. She had herself. And she had a plan that nobody in Richard Caldwell's orbit had thought to look for, because they had already decided she was not capable of one. 6 weeks after Rossy was locked out of her home, she walked into a small family law firm on the north side of Chicago and asked if they were hiring anyone for administrative work, answering phones, filing documents, anything that would keep her in proximity to a legal environment while she figured out her next step. They were. She started the following Monday. She answered phones. She made coffee. She organized files. She listened. That last part, the listening, turned out to be the most important thing she did in those first weeks, because Rossy Caldwell had spent 14 years keeping an exceptionally sharp mind occupied with work that did not require it, and the moment she was placed in an environment where the thinking was complex and consequential, something in her woke up with a force that surprised even her. On her third day at the firm, she sat in on a deposition, not as a participant, just as an observer helping to organize documents. She watched the firm's senior paralegal walk into that room and methodically, without drama, without speeches, without anything other than perfectly organized evidence, dismantle opposing counsel's entire argument. It took 40 minutes. By the end of it, the attorney across the table was gathering his papers with the particular quietness of a man who knows he has lost. Rossy watched the whole thing and felt something shift inside her. Not inspiration, exactly. Something closer to recognition. Like watching someone do something that you have always been capable of and simply have not been given the opportunity to do yet. That night, she went back to her friend's apartment and enrolled in a paralegal certification program. Evening classes. 3 nights a week. She went to class after her shift at the firm and studied on the bus ride home and read case materials on her lunch breaks and wrote assignments in the parking lot during the 10 minutes before she had to go back inside. Her supervising attorney at the firm, a woman named Patricia Reeves who had been practicing family law for 22 years, noticed Rossy within the first month. Not because Rossy was trying to be noticed. Because Patricia Reeves had spent 2 decades developing the ability to identify when someone genuinely understood the work, and Rossy understood it in a way that most people who had been doing it for years did not. Patricia gave her more responsibility. More complex files. Research assignments that went beyond what her role technically required. And Rossy delivered on every single one of them. Within 12 months of walking through that firm's door, Rossy Harmon, going back to her maiden name professionally because she had already decided who she was going to be on the other side of this, had her paralegal certification. She had been published in the firm's client newsletter twice. She had been referenced by name in 3 internal case memos as the researcher whose work had been instrumental in the outcome. And she had started something else, quietly, without telling anyone outside her immediate circle. Something she had been thinking about since the moment she stood on that porch with a key that did not fit the lock anymore. She had enrolled in an online law degree program. The program was accredited, rigorous, and designed for working professionals who could not attend traditional classes. It required discipline of a kind that most people would have found extraordinary given Rossy's circumstances. She was working full-time. She was raising Harmony and Marcus on alternating weekends, driving back to the house that had been her home for 11 years to pick them up from the porch, because Richard had made it clear she was not welcome inside. She was living in a 1-bedroom apartment that she had moved into after saving for 6 months for the security deposit, sleeping on the pull-out couch whenever the children stayed so that Harmony and Marcus could have the bedroom. She was doing all of this while completing law school coursework at a level that placed her in the top 15% of her cohort. She studied at 2 in the morning. She studied on her phone on the train. She studied on the floor of the laundry room in her apartment building while her clothes ran through a cycle because it was the only hour she had available. She submitted papers that her professors described, in feedback she still has printed and folded in a drawer somewhere, as among the clearest legal analyses they had encountered from a distance learning student in their combined decades of teaching. And while all of this was happening, while Rossy was rebuilding herself, brick by brick, in the spaces Richard had not thought to watch because he had already decided they were empty, Richard was telling anyone who would listen that his ex-wife was struggling. That she had no future. That she had never had the capability to build one. He said this at dinner parties. He said it on the golf course. He said it in the particular casual, generous-sounding way that people use when they want cruelty to be mistaken for honesty. He was absolutely certain of what he was saying because he had absolutely no idea what was happening in the world he had pushed Rossy into when he changed those locks. That certainty was about to cost him more than he had ever lost in his life. Rossy Caldwell sat for the bar exam on a Wednesday morning in February, roughly 2.5 years after standing on her own porch with a key that did not fit. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything in those years, methodically, completely, without the luxury of taking any moment for granted. The bar exam is one of the most difficult professional licensing tests in the United States. The pass rate in Illinois hovers, depending on the year, somewhere around 50 to 60% for first-time takers. For people who took it while working full-time, raising children on alternating weekends, and rebuilding their entire professional identity from the ground up, the rate is considerably lower, because most people in those circumstances do not attempt it at all. They wait. They defer. They decide that the timing is not right and that there will be a better moment somewhere down the road. Rossy did not wait. She sat for the exam and she passed it. She found out on a Thursday afternoon, standing in the parking lot of her apartment building, reading her results on her phone with her hand pressed flat against the cold metal of her car door because she needed something solid to hold on to. She passed. She sat in her car for a while after that. She did not call Richard. She did not post anything publicly. She texted her mother in Columbus a single line that her mother still has on her phone today. "Mom. I passed. Don't say anything yet." Her mother called her immediately and they spoke for 45 minutes, and what was said in that conversation belongs entirely to the two of them, but the woman who walked back into her apartment afterward had a quality about her that her colleagues at the firm noticed the very next morning. Not different, exactly. More settled. Like someone who has been waiting for a confirmation that they already knew was coming, and it has finally arrived, and they can now proceed. She accepted a position at Harman & Reed within 8 weeks of passing the bar. Harman & Reed was not a small firm, not a stepping stone, not a place people went when they were still figuring things out. It was one of the most respected family law practices in the state, the kind of firm whose name meant something when it appeared on a legal filing, the kind of firm that opposing counsel prepared for differently than they prepared for everyone else. Marcus Harman, the founding partner, had a reputation for taking on cases that mattered and winning them through preparation so thorough that by the time a case reached a courtroom, the outcome had already been decided. He had reviewed Rossy's application himself. He had interviewed her for 2 hours. And at the end of those 2 hours, he had offered her a position as an associate specializing in family law and estate planning, because, he told her directly, she was the most precisely prepared candidate he had interviewed in 3 years, and Harman & Reed did not pass on that when it walked through the door. Rossy accepted. She did not tell Richard. She did not post the announcement on any platform where his name or his colleagues might encounter it. She simply showed up at Harman & Reed on her first day in the navy suit she had bought with the first substantial paycheck from the firm, the suit that fit like it had been made for exactly this version of her, and she began building the professional reputation that, over the next 18 months, would become the foundation of everything that was about to happen in that courtroom. She attended professional conferences in the family law space. She published 3 articles in legal journals, careful, precise analyses of asset concealment patterns in high-income divorce cases, a topic she had chosen, not by accident, because it was directly relevant to the case she was already quietly building against her husband. She built relationships in the professional community, not strategically in the way that word sometimes implies, but genuinely, because Rossy Caldwell was the kind of person that other professionals in her field wanted to know, and those relationships grew naturally out of the quality of her work and the sincerity of her engagement with it. And at a certain point, after the firm had watched her for 18 months and understood exactly what they had in her, Patricia, her old supervisor, and Marcus Harman sat down with Rossy and had the conversation she had been waiting for. It was time to bring in a forensic accountant. It was time to start building the evidentiary case. It was time, in other words, to open the folder. Paulette Marsh had spent 20 years doing one thing exceptionally well. She found hidden money. She found it in offshore accounts and shell companies and cryptocurrency wallets and real estate parcels held in borrowed names and retirement vehicles and business interests structured to look like something other than what they were. She had worked on over 300 divorce cases. She had testified as an expert witness in state and federal proceedings. She had, on more than one occasion, found assets that the opposing party's own accountants had not located, because the people who hid money rarely anticipated someone with Paulette's specific combination of patience and methodology coming after it. When Rossy's team brought her in and gave her access to Richard Caldwell's publicly available financial information, his firm's billing records, his corporate filings, his property records, and the tax returns that had been produced during the discovery phase of the divorce proceedings, Paulette began by doing what she always did. She looked for the places where the numbers told two different stories. Richard's reported income, taken at face value, was substantial. A corporate attorney at his level, with his client roster and his billing history, earned well. But when Paulette placed that income against his spending patterns, a gap appeared. Not a small gap. Not the kind of gap that happens when someone is a little freer with their entertainment budget than they should be. A gap of roughly 60%. The restaurant bills, the country club membership, the luxury vehicle payments, the private school tuition for Harmony and Marcus, the home maintenance on a property valued at over $1 million, the travel, the clothing, the accumulated texture of the life Richard Caldwell presented to the world, all of it added up to substantially more than his declared income could account for. Paulette had seen this pattern before. It meant money was coming from somewhere that was not appearing on the official documents. It meant a trail. She followed it. It took 11 days of intensive work, cross-referencing bank records, wire transfer logs, corporate registration databases, and digital footprints that most people did not know existed and even fewer people knew how to read. The trail led to a limited liability company registered in Delaware. The company was registered under the name Jason Pelton. Jason Pelton was Richard Caldwell's college roommate, a man who had worked in commercial real estate in Atlanta for the past 15 years and who, by every public record available, had no formal business relationship with Richard of any kind. The company had been created 18 months before the divorce was filed. Monthly transfers moved from Richard's business operating account into the Delaware LLC. From the Delaware LLC, the funds moved into 2 offshore accounts in jurisdictions chosen, Paulette told Rossy's team in a conference room at Harmon and Reed, specifically for their limited cooperation with American asset disclosure requirements. The total amount moved through this structure, over the 18 months of its operation, was $683,000. Paulette was not finished. She pulled the IP address logs for the online banking activity associated with the LLC's accounts. The transactions had been initiated from 2 locations: Richard Caldwell's law firm network and his home address. During business hours. From his office computer. The man who had locked his wife out of their home and frozen her accounts and filed court documents describing her as a financially destitute woman with no professional prospects had been moving $683,000 in marital assets into offshore accounts from his desk at work. He had done it methodically. He had done it over 18 months. And he had done it with the confidence of a man who believed that the woman he had dismissed as having nothing was exactly that. He was wrong. And Paulette Marsh had the documentation to prove it, down to the timestamp, the IP address, and the transaction number, on every single transfer. When Rossy sat in that Harmon and Reed conference room and heard Paulette walk through the findings, she was quiet for a long time afterward. Not because she was surprised. She had suspected, given what she had learned over 18 months of working in family law, that Richard had almost certainly moved money. But hearing the specific number, hearing the specific methodology, hearing how carefully and deliberately it had been done while he was simultaneously presenting her to the court as a burden, as a liability, as a woman who deserved nothing because she had contributed nothing, that hit differently than she had anticipated. She looked at Marcus Harmon across the table. "File the emergency motion," she said. "File everything." There was one more thing Paulette had found, and she mentioned it carefully, because it was a different category of problem entirely. In Richard's firm billing records, which had been produced as part of the broader financial discovery, there were irregularities. Blocks of billable hours that did not align with documented court appearances, client meetings, or any external calendar entries that Paulette had been able to identify. The pattern, across 4 major client accounts over approximately 2 years, suggested roughly $90,000 in overbilled hours. That was not a divorce court issue. That was a state bar association issue. It was the kind of finding that could end a legal career. Rossy looked at the table for a moment when Paulette finished. Then she looked up. "We include it," she said. "Not because I want to destroy him. Because his clients have a right to know. And the court has a right to see exactly who they are dealing with. Marcus Harmon nodded. Victoria Chen, the firm's asset division specialist, began drafting the filing immediately. The morning of the first hearing, Rossy was up at 5. She made coffee in her small kitchen, reviewed her notes for the last time, and stood in front of the bathroom mirror in the navy suit for a long moment. She had been preparing for this day for 3 years. Not preparing in the abstract sense, not mentally rehearsing or emotionally steeling herself, but preparing the way you prepare when you are an attorney who has spent 18 months building a case that you intend to present in the most effective and accurate way possible. She knew the documents in that folder better than she had ever known anything. She knew which page contained which number and why that number mattered and what it connected to and what it proved. She picked up the folder. She walked out the door. Across town, Richard Caldwell was being driven to the courthouse in a car service he had used for years. He was on his phone. He was not worried. He had never seriously been worried. Gregory Harlow had assured him, more than once, that the case was as clean as it could be. Rossy had no representation. She had limited visible assets. She had no professional standing in the legal community that anyone on Richard's team had been able to identify. She was proceeding pro se, representing herself, which in Richard's experience as an attorney meant one of two things. Either someone could not afford counsel or someone was genuinely unaware of what they were walking into. He had assumed the former. He was catastrophically wrong about the latter. Family Court, Room 247. The room was exactly as courtrooms always are, wood and fluorescent light and the particular kind of institutional quiet that comes from a space where difficult things happen regularly and the architecture has absorbed all of it. Rossy sat alone at the respondent's table. Folder in front of her. One pen. Her blazer pressed perfectly. Her natural hair pinned back. Small gold earrings, the only jewelry she had kept from before, not because she could not afford others but because these were hers, genuinely hers, from before the marriage, and that continuity mattered to her. Across the aisle, Richard sat in his charcoal suit with Gregory Harlow beside him and a stack of color-coded documents spread across the table like evidence of resources that nobody in the room was supposed to miss. He did not look at Rossy when he came in. He did not need to. He already knew what he was going to see. Judge Margaret Osei entered from the side door and the room rose. She was a woman in her late 50s with 22 years on the family court bench and the particular quality of attention that comes from spending 2 decades watching people perform in courtrooms and developing an extremely precise calibration for the difference between performance and truth. She sat. She adjusted her glasses. She opened the case file. She looked at both tables. She began. Gregory Harlow presented Richard's case with practiced fluency. Rossy had abandoned the marital home. Rossy had no income of substance. Rossy had no professional standing. Richard had been the sole provider. Richard had maintained the household. Richard sought full custody, the family home, and financial support from his wife. It was polished. It was well structured. It moved at exactly the pace a skilled attorney deploys when he wants a judge to register certainty without pausing long enough to question it. Richard, emboldened by the performance and by 3 years of absolutely unchallenged confidence that this moment would go exactly as he had planned it, leaned toward Gregory and whispered something that Rossy, 2 tables away, heard clearly. "This should be quick," he said. Gregory did not respond. But he smiled. Judge Osei's eyes moved briefly toward them. She said nothing. She turned to Rossy. "Mrs. Caldwell, you filed a counter-motion. You're proceeding pro se today?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rossy said. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone who had rehearsed nothing because she had prepared everything. Richard could not help himself. He stood, without being called upon, and addressed the court with the ease of a man who had done it 1,000 times professionally and saw no reason to modulate that ease in a room where his own marriage was being dissolved. He pointed out that Rossy could not afford legal representation. He gestured toward her folder with the particular brand of condescension that requires a certain kind of practiced confidence to perform in public. He said, in open court, with his attorney beside him and the gallery behind him and a 22-year veteran judge in front of him, that his wife was sitting there with a folder and a pen like she was at a PTA meeting. He said she had no assets, no income, no ability to provide for their children. He asked, rhetorically, how a woman who could not afford a lawyer was going to afford their kids. He was performing, the way men who have spent a long time winning perform when they believe there is nothing at stake. And Judge Osei let him finish. And then she said, in a voice that dropped rather than rose, "Sit down, Mr. Caldwell." There was something in that instruction that was different from a standard courtroom directive. It was the voice of a judge who has identified exactly what she is dealing with and is now deciding, with calm precision, how to proceed. Richard sat. He was still smirking. Judge Osei turned to Rossy. "Mrs. Caldwell, your response." And Rossy Caldwell stood up and spoke for 4 minutes. She did not perform. She did not make speeches. She presented, in the measured and precise language of an attorney who understands that a courtroom is not a theater but an evidentiary proceeding, the basic facts of what her marriage had actually been and what the separation had actually involved. She spoke about the 14 years. She spoke about the 2 jobs she had worked while Richard studied for the bar. She spoke about the career she had put on hold, the education she had deferred, the professional life she had set aside because they had agreed it was best for the family they were building together. She spoke about the locked door and the frozen accounts and the narrative that had been delivered to her children. She spoke about living in a 1-bedroom apartment and working full-time and rebuilding her life from the ground up. And she ended by saying, without drama, without anything that could be described as theatrical, that she did not have a high-powered legal team. But she had the truth. Richard laughed. He actually laughed, out loud, in open court, at that line. And that was the moment the room changed. Because Judge Osei turned toward him with the slow, complete attention of a woman who has seen this particular performance before and has run entirely out of patience for it. "Did you find something amusing, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked. The smirk on Richard's face did not disappear slowly. It simply stopped. And the silence that followed that question was the kind of silence that tells you something has just shifted in a room and is not going to shift back. Judge Osei turned back to Rossy and asked her to provide documentation of her employment and income since the separation. Rossy opened the folder. She walked forward and placed the documents with the bailiff, who carried them to the bench. Richard watched this with the mild impatience of a man waiting for a formality to conclude. Gregory was reviewing something on his own table. Neither of them was paying the kind of attention they should have been paying. Judge Osei began reading. The room waited. Richard checked his watch. Gregory organized a paper clip. And then Judge Osei's expression did something that the reporters sitting in the back of the gallery would later describe differently depending on who you asked, some calling it surprise, some calling it recognition, some simply calling it a shift, like a door opening slightly in a face that had been closed all morning. She looked up from the documents. She looked at Rossy. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said. "According to these tax filings, you've reported substantial income over the past 2 years. Would you like to explain that?" "Yes, Your Honor," Rossy said. "While working as a paralegal, I completed my law degree through an accredited distance learning program. I passed the bar exam 8 months ago. I am currently employed as an associate attorney at Harmon & Reed, specializing in family law and estate planning." The courtroom went still in the particular way that a room goes still when a large number of people simultaneously recalibrate their understanding of what they are watching. Richard's smirk did not fade. It collapsed. He sat forward in his chair and stared at his wife with the expression of a man encountering something that his entire model of the world had not made room for. Gregory Harlow pulled out his phone under the table and began typing with the rapid, compressed motion of someone confirming something they already fear is true. Richard grabbed his arm. "What? What is it?" Gregory did not answer. His face had gone the color of old paper. What Gregory had found in those seconds, what the name Harmon and Reed had triggered in his memory and his phone's search results simultaneously, was this: Marcus Harmon, the founding senior partner of Rossy's firm, was Judge Margaret Osei's former law school roommate. They had maintained a professional relationship for over 30 years. Gregory had walked his client into a courtroom to argue against a woman who worked at the firm of the judge's closest professional colleague, and he had done it without knowing that fact because he had not thought to look for it, because his client had told him, with the certainty of a man who believed he already knew everything relevant, that his wife was a paralegal with no standing and no representation. Judge Osei looked at Richard. "Mr. Caldwell, it appears your assessment of your wife's financial situation was significantly inaccurate." Richard's voice came out strained. "Your Honor, I had no idea she was that," Judge Osei said, and the word landed with the weight of everything she had watched in that courtroom for the past 40 minutes, "is becoming abundantly clear. She ordered full financial disclosures from both parties within 7 days. She told Richard, directly and without softening the instruction, that she expected everything. Every account. Every investment. Every business interest. Every asset of any kind. And she told him, looking at him over the top of her reading glasses with the complete and unwavering attention of a woman who has spent 2 decades developing the ability to distinguish between people who are telling the truth and people who are constructing an alternative, that if she found so much as a savings bond that had been omitted, she would not be pleased." The gavel came down. The hearing was adjourned. Richard turned on Gregory the moment the judge exited. What just happened? Gregory was already packing his briefcase with the compressed efficiency of a man who has a great deal of work to do very quickly. "What happened," Gregory said, "is that you underestimated your wife and made yourself look like a fool in front of a judge who does not forget things like that. That is what happened." He snapped the briefcase shut. "We need to talk. Now." On the other side of the room, Rossy was collecting her documents, placing them back in the folder with the same careful, unhurried motion she had used to take them out. She did not look at Richard. She did not acknowledge him. She simply closed the folder, picked up her pen, and walked toward the exit. As she passed his table, Richard called her name. She stopped. She turned. Her eyes met his for the first time that morning. "This isn't over," he said. His voice was low. It was the voice of a man reaching for the only leverage he could still identify in a situation that had just moved beyond his control. Rossy looked at him for a moment. "You're right," she said. "It's just beginning." And she walked out. Her heels on the marble floor made a sound that everyone in that emptying courtroom could hear. Clear. Even. Not hurried. The sound of someone who knows exactly where they are going. 3 days after the first hearing, at 2 a.m, Rossy was at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her, cross-referencing Paulette's forensic findings against the timeline of Richard's spending patterns, when her email notification appeared. Gregory Harlow's firm. Amended financial disclosure. She opened the attachment. She read through it once, quickly, and then again, slowly. Richard had disclosed the offshore accounts. He had disclosed the cryptocurrency wallet. He had disclosed, in a legal filing carrying his own signature, $470,000 in assets that had not appeared anywhere in his original financial statement. The explanation offered at the bottom of the disclosure, in careful legal language, was that these accounts had been inadvertently omitted from the initial filing due to an administrative oversight, and that the filing party apologized for any confusion this may have caused. Rossy read that line twice. Then she laughed. She laughed in her empty apartment at 2 a.m, a genuine, unguarded laugh, the kind that comes when something that was serious for a very long time suddenly reveals its absurdity. Administrative oversight. They had found out she had forensic accountants. They had panicked. They had filed the amended disclosure hoping to get ahead of what they could already feel coming. And in doing so, Richard Caldwell, corporate attorney, had signed a document that constituted a legal admission that he had hidden nearly $500,000 in marital assets. He had handed them the foundation for a fraud argument, with his name on it. She forwarded the email to Marcus Harmon, Victoria Chen, and Paulette Marsh at 2:14 in the morning with a single line. They are running scared. File everything. Marcus called her back within minutes. His voice carried the particular quality of a man who has been doing this for a long time and still experiences something like satisfaction when the work lands exactly right. He just admitted to hiding the money, Marcus said. Even with the excuse, the admission is in the document. Judge Osei is going to read this as exactly what it is. File the emergency motion, Rossy said. I want everything in front of her before Monday. We'll file first thing in the morning, Marcus said. Get some sleep. She did not get much sleep. But she lay down. And for the first time in a long time, the ceiling of her apartment did not feel like something pressing down. It felt like something that was simply there, above her, while below it she existed, whole and capable and ready. The emergency motion was filed at 9 the following morning. By noon, Gregory Harlow's office had called Marcus Harmon's office 17 times. By 2 in the afternoon, Richard himself had left a voicemail at the firm, his voice cycling through several registers in the space of 40 seconds, landing somewhere between confusion and anger and something that, if you listened carefully, was the beginning of genuine fear. Judge Osei read the motion that Friday evening. She scheduled a Saturday hearing. She almost never did that. In 22 years on the family court bench, she had called Saturday emergency hearings fewer than a dozen times, and every attorney who practiced in her courtroom knew that a Saturday scheduling meant she had read something in a filing that she was not willing to wait the standard time to address. When word got out, which it did, because the legal community in this city was not as large or as sealed as people sometimes imagined, the reporters began making calls. By Saturday morning, 2 news vans were parked outside the courthouse. Rossy arrived at 8:30 in a charcoal suit, walked through the small cluster of journalists without stopping, and took her seat at the respondents' table. Her mother and her sister sat in the front row of the gallery. Colleagues from Harmon and Reed sat behind them. On Richard's side, his law partners occupied 3 rows, their expressions carrying the particular controlled blankness of people managing a situation that has already deteriorated past what they had prepared for. His mother sat near the back, her purse held in both hands. Richard arrived looking like a man who had not slept since Tuesday. His suit was impeccable, because Richard Caldwell was the kind of person whose exterior presentation was the last thing to go, but his eyes told a different story. Gregory sat beside him and said something into his ear that Richard appeared to hear without registering. Judge Osei entered. The room stood. She sat. She looked at both tables. She did not open with pleasantries. Mr. Harlow, she said. Your client disclosed $470,000 in previously undisclosed accounts after Mrs. Caldwell's team indicated they had retained a forensic accountant. That is not cooperation. That is damage control. According to the filing submitted yesterday, he is still concealing over $200,000 in additional assets. How do you explain that? Gregory rose. He offered the administrative oversight explanation again, with somewhat less conviction than it had carried in the written filing. Judge Osei looked at him for a moment. Your client forgot about $700,000 in marital assets, she said. Does that explanation sound credible to you, counselor? The silence in the room was of a specific texture. It was the silence of a question that everyone present knew had only one honest answer, and that honest answer was not available to the person being asked. Gregory said nothing. Judge Osei turned to Marcus Harmon. Marcus presented Paulette Marsh's findings with the complete, precise fluency of a senior attorney presenting work he trusts entirely. The shell company. The Delaware registration. The monthly transfers. The offshore accounts. The IP address logs tracing every transaction to Richard's office computer and home address. The timestamps. The transaction numbers. The total, $683,000, moved deliberately, systematically, over 18 months, beginning well before the divorce filing, from marital funds into a structure designed to place them beyond the court's visibility. By the time Marcus finished, the room was very quiet. Judge Osei reviewed the documents. She reviewed them carefully, the way she reviewed everything, without rushing, without performing the act of reading for the benefit of the people watching her. Then she set them down. Then she ruled. Account freeze. Effective immediately. All accounts, all entities, all interests connected to Richard Caldwell, personal and professional, frozen pending the court-supervised audit. Court-supervised forensic audit, to be conducted at Richard's expense, covering the full scope of his financial activity for the preceding 3 years. Sanctions, $50,000, payable to Rossy's legal team, representing the cost of locating information that Richard had been legally obligated to disclose voluntarily. And a referral to the Illinois State Bar Association, citing the billing irregularities identified in Paulette Marsh's review of his firm's records, for independent investigation into potential professional misconduct. Richard stood. Your Honor, those billing allegations are completely, Mr. Caldwell. Judge Osei's voice did not rise. It fell. It fell to a register that was quieter than anything she had used all morning and more final than all of it combined. You have said quite enough in my courtroom. Sit down. Or I will hold you in contempt. He sat. His mother, in the gallery, pressed both hands over her mouth. His law partners exchanged a look that said, without words, what everyone in that room was already thinking. This was no longer a divorce hearing. This was a reckoning. Judge Osei set down her pen. She looked at Richard Caldwell with the full, unhurried attention of a judge who has something to say and intends to say it clearly. You came into this courtroom, she said, believing your wife was beneath you. You believed she had no power, no resources, and no future worth taking seriously. You told this court she could not even afford legal representation. You laughed at her. And all the while, you were concealing nearly $750,000 in marital assets and billing your own clients for hours you did not work. A pause. You were wrong about her. Spectacularly wrong. And your arrogance has cost you more than money. The gavel fell. The room exhaled. Monday morning arrived cold and clear. Rossy dressed in the navy suit, the one from her first day at Harmon and Reed, the one that felt, every time she put it on, like a reminder of the distance she had traveled. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment. Not for reassurance. She was past needing that. More like acknowledgement. The way you look at something you built and let yourself recognize it before you move on to the next thing. She drove to the courthouse. Her mother and sister were already in the gallery when she arrived. Marcus and Victoria flanked her at the respondents' table. Richard entered minutes later with Gregory, both of them carrying the particular quietness of men who have spent the weekend reviewing a situation and have arrived at a clear understanding that the available options have narrowed significantly. Judge Osei entered at 9 exactly. She arranged her papers. She looked out over the room. I have reviewed all submissions from both parties, she said. I have considered the financial disclosures, the forensic accounting findings, and the conduct that has been demonstrated throughout these proceedings. I am prepared to rule. The courtroom was still. Rossy sat with her hands folded on the table, her folder closed beside her, her expression the same composed, professional stillness she had brought into this building on the very first morning. Custody. Joint legal custody, with physical custody split 60% in favor of Rossy and 40% allocated to Richard, with the children residing primarily with their mother, alternate weekends and 1 weeknight per week with their father. Richard's face changed at that. Not dramatically. Just a compression, a tightening around the eyes, the face of a man processing a loss that is specific and personal in a way that financial losses are not. His mother, in the gallery, began to cry quietly. Asset division. Given the documented, deliberate concealment of marital assets, 65% of all community property to Rossy. The family home to be sold, with proceeds divided according to the asset split. All retirement accounts, all investment portfolios, all funds identified through the forensic audit, divided accordingly. Richard to assume all marital debt. Spousal support, $4,000 per month for 5 years. Child support per state guidelines. The sanctions already ordered remained in effect. Judge Osei set down the ruling documents. She looked at Richard Caldwell one final time. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "you tried to punish your wife for wanting more from her life. You locked her out of her home and froze her accounts and told her children she had abandoned them. You came into this courtroom and laughed at her. You hid $750,000 and billed your own clients for work you did not do." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "And while you were doing all of that, she completed law school, passed the bar, built a career at one of the finest family law firms in this state, and walked into my courtroom with more credibility and more documented evidence than your entire legal team combined." A pause long enough to let the room understand that what came next was not a formality but a conclusion. Let this be a lesson. When you decide that someone has nothing, make sure you understand everything they are building with the silence you gave them. The gavel came down. And that was the end of it. Outside the courthouse, on the steps in the late morning light, with 2 news cameras and a handful of reporters arranging themselves in front of her, Rossy Caldwell made a brief statement. She had not prepared it in advance. She did not need to. "For a long time," she said, "I was told that I had no value without my husband. That I should be grateful for whatever I was given. Today, a judge reminded everyone in that courtroom that the truth matters. That you cannot build a life on lies and expect it to stand. This was never about revenge. It was about my children seeing that their mother fought for what was right, even when the people around her had already decided she could not win. I hope anyone watching this understands that being told you have nothing is not the same as having nothing. You can rebuild. You can fight back. And you can win." She nodded to Marcus and Victoria. They walked her through the cameras and into the parking garage and to her car, the reliable Japanese sedan she had bought with her own first substantial paycheck, a car that was not a status symbol and was not designed to be, a car that started every morning and got her where she needed to go and belonged entirely to her. Richard Caldwell did not make a statement. He got into a car in the parking garage and left. The Illinois State Bar Association opened a formal investigation into the billing irregularities within 3 weeks of the referral. That investigation, which fell outside the jurisdiction of the divorce proceedings and followed its own timeline and its own process, was ongoing at the time of this writing, and its outcome remained to be determined. But the referral had been made, the documentation had been filed, and whatever came from that process would come in its own time, as these things do, through the same system that Richard had spent his career navigating with such competent expertise. The case, in its final form, was a matter of public record. The asset concealment, the sanctions, the 65% asset split, the forensic audit findings, all of it was accessible to anyone who knew where to look. Richard's law partners, the ones who had sat in the gallery that Saturday with their controlled, careful expressions, had decisions of their own to make in the weeks that followed, professional decisions about what the situation meant for the firm and for the name above the door and for the clients who called that office when they needed someone they could trust. Those decisions, too, were their own. What belonged to Rossy was this: Harmony came home. And Marcus came home. And the 1-bedroom apartment that had been her entire world for the better part of 3 years, the apartment where she had slept on the pull-out couch so her children could have the bedroom, the apartment where she had studied for the bar exam and written the legal articles and built the professional relationships that had quietly, over 18 months, made her something Richard had never imagined her becoming. That apartment was no longer her final destination. She had the resources now, through the settlement and through her own salary, to find something larger. Something that belonged to her children as much as to her. She was looking. On the evening after the final hearing, sitting in that apartment for one of the last times, she received a text message from Harmony. 4 words. "I'm coming home, Mom." She read it and pressed the phone against her chest and sat in the quiet of the place that had, against all of the odds that had been stacked against her, turned out to be exactly large enough to hold everything she needed to become who she was. She had gone into that courtroom with a folder. And what the folder contained was not a legal strategy, not a collection of clever arguments, not a performance designed to impress anyone. It was the record of 3 years of unwitnessed, unannounced, completely unglamorous work. Law school coursework at 2 in the morning. Bar exam preparation in a parking lot. Journal articles written on a second-hand laptop. Professional relationships built through the quality of her work and the consistency of her character. The truth, organized. And when Judge Margaret O'Say opened that folder and looked up at Rossy Caldwell and said, "You already did understand," she was saying something that was both a legal observation and something considerably larger. She was saying that the woman sitting alone at that table, with no attorney and no team and no resources that anyone in that room had been able to see, had understood, from the very beginning, exactly what she was worth. And she had spent 3 years making sure the court understood it too. This story is not about a divorce. Or rather, it is about a divorce the way a marathon is about running. The divorce is just the form the thing takes. What this story is actually about is what people do with the space that opens up when someone decides they are finished with you. Richard Caldwell created that space. He locked the door, he froze the accounts, he built the narrative, and he handed Rossy Caldwell the one thing he had been, over 14 years of marriage, consistently failing to give her. Time. He gave her time to become, without interference and without compromise and without the constant low-level pressure of a household organized around someone else's priorities, exactly who she had been capable of being in that law school library at 26 years old. He gave her the quiet. And she used every second of it. There is something in this story for anyone who has ever been told, in whatever form that message takes, that they are less than they are. That their window has passed. That the version of themselves they once believed in belongs to a different chapter that is now closed. Rossy Caldwell was 39 years old when she passed the bar exam. She was living on a pull-out couch. She had a second-hand laptop and a one-bedroom apartment and a court case stacked against her by a man with every structural advantage available in a situation like this. And she won. Not because the system suddenly started working the way it is supposed to. Not because a sympathetic judge decided to give a deserving woman a break. She won because she had built, in the silence and the difficulty and the unseeable months of work that nobody was watching, something that the truth always eventually builds when it is given enough time and enough will. A case that could not be argued against. I want to know what this story brought up for you. Because I think it reaches something specific, something about the gap between how we are seen and who we actually are, and what it takes to close that gap when the people around you have a stake in it staying open. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every one of them. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Not because it is remarkable in the way that dramatic things are remarkable, but because it is true in the way that real things are true, and sometimes that is exactly what someone needs to be reminded of. If you have not subscribed yet, do that now, because the next story I am bringing you is about a woman who spent 11 years being told by every person in her life that she was remembering things wrong. And what happened when she finally found the one person who believed her is something you are going to want to be here for. Until then, remember this. The most powerful thing in any room is not always the loudest thing. Sometimes it is the quietest. Sometimes it is a woman with a folder and 3 years of work inside it and the complete, unshakable knowledge of exactly who she is.